Death on the Nile, a Miss Marple mystery. Part 1, a floating village. The sun upon the Nile was a hammer of gold, beating down on the luxurious steamer Karnak as it glided through waters as timeless as sin. On the shaded deck, seated in a comfortable wicker chair beside her friend and benefactor, Mrs. Lavinia Clements, Miss Jane Marple knitted. Her needles clicked a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the lazy churn of the paddle wheel. To any observer, she was a picture of a harmless, elderly English lady on a recuperative holiday, her pale blue eyes often seeming to be half closed in a doze. But behind those eyes, a keen and unsentimental mind was wide awake, cataloguing and comparing. "It is really most like a village, Lavinia," she murmured, not looking up from her wool, a delicate shade of lilac. Mrs. Clements, a stout woman with a kind face and a robust constitution recently tested by illness, chuckled. "A village, Jane? This floating palace? With its Persian rugs and silver service? I think St. Mary Mead has rather fewer comforts." "Oh, the trappings are different," Miss Marple conceded, her gaze drifting across the deck. "But the essential characters are all here. One only has to know where to look." And she began to point them out, not with her finger, but with a gentle inclination of her head and the soft flow of her words. There was a squire's daughter, of course, the impossibly rich, beautiful, and newly married Linnet Doyle. So like Miss Amanda Van Derlyn, you remember? The one who inherited the Hammond fortune. Everyone admired her, and so many, I'm afraid, secretly resented her. It is a great burden to be so fortunate, Lavinia. It isolates one. And where the squire's daughter was, one always found the squire. Simon Doyle, with his boyish charm and hearty manner, trailed in his wife's radiant wake. "He is very attentive," Miss Marple observed. "A little too attentive, perhaps. It puts me in mind of Mr. Roderick Hale, who married the brewer's widow. He was forever fetching her shawl or adjusting her cushion, but his eyes, when he thought no one was looking, were always counting the silver." Then there was the inevitable shadow, Jacqueline de Bellefort, a slender, intense girl with tragic eyes, who had been Simon's fiancée before he was Linnet's husband. She was a haunting presence on the boat, a living reproach. "The jilted woman," Miss Marple said with a quiet sigh. "A dangerous role. I recall a similar situation with young Sarah Beck and the farmhand William Prime. When William threw her over for the dairymaid, Sarah took to wandering past their cottage at all hours, singing mournful songs. It ended rather badly with a pitchfork and a great deal of unpleasantness. Passion like that, it does not simply vanish. It must go somewhere." The other passengers formed the chorus of this floating drama. The formidable American matron, Mrs. Van Schuyler, who was a village gossip and busybody, always knowing everyone's business and finding it wanting. Her poor companion, Miss Bowers, long-suffering and sharp-tongued, was a put-upon servant, her true feelings hidden behind a mask of efficiency. The vociferous novelist, Salome Otterborn, who dressed in flowing silks and spoke in dramatic pronouncements, was clearly the eccentric artist, forever misreading the people around her for the sake of a good story. Her sullen daughter, Rosalie, was a rebellious daughter, bristling with resentment at her mother and the world. The Austrian doctor, Karl Bessner, with his thick accent and pronouncements on nerves, was a country doctor, sure of his own expertise. The brash American lawyer, Andrew Pennington, Linnet's trustee, was a smooth-talking man of business, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. And then there was a young, handsome socialist, Mr. Ferguson, who scorned the wealth around him while enjoying its comforts. "He is like the vicar's new curate," Miss Marple explained to a bewildered Mrs. Clements. "So very fierce about the evils of money, yet he never seems to refuse a second helping of roast beef at the Sunday luncheon." The drama began to simmer that very afternoon. Miss Marple, seeking a quiet spot to read her Baedeker, found a secluded nook near the stain, only to stumble upon a confrontation. Jacqueline de Bellefort stood facing Simon and Linnet Doyle. The air was thick with a poisonous tension. "You can't hide from me forever, Simon." Jackie's voice was low, but it vibrated with raw feeling. "You belong to me. This is just a mistake. A ghastly, expensive mistake." Linnet, pale but proud, drew herself up. "Jackie, this is intolerable. You must leave us alone." "Must I?" Jackie gave a short, bitter laugh. She reached into her small, chic handbag and pulled out a small pearl-handled pistol. It was a feminine, deadly thing. She waved it negligently. "Don't worry, my dear. I'm not going to shoot you. Not now. But I might later. It's so dreadfully easy. You know, just one little squeeze." Simon Doyle took a step forward, his face a mask of anger and fear. "Jackie, for God's sake." But Jackie had already turned, the pistol vanishing back into her bag as if it were nothing more menacing than a lipstick. She walked away, leaving a silence more terrifying than any outburst. Miss Marple, unseen, retreated quietly. She did not mention the scene to anyone, not even Lavinia, but she thought of it often. The pistol was a fact, a hard, dangerous fact. But to Miss Marple, the more telling thing had been the look on Simon Doyle's face. It hadn't been just fear for his wife or anger at his ex-lover. There had been something else flickering in his eyes, a calculation, swift and cold. It was a look of a man who was not just reacting to a threat, but recalculating a complex plan. That evening, the atmosphere in the dining saloon was strained. Jacqueline sat at a table alone, drinking steadily, her eyes fixed with unnerving intensity on the honeymooners' table. Linnet was visibly on edge, jumping at the clatter of a dropped fork. Simon was overly hearty, his laughter a shade too loud. Later, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she heard a soft, furtive sound in the corridor outside her cabin. Peering through a crack in the door, she saw a figure, a woman's figure. She thought, slipping away into the shadows. She couldn't be sure who it was. She got into her bed, but sleep was slow to come. The gentle rocking of the boat was no longer soothing. It felt like the rocking of a cradle over an abyss. The Karnak was no longer just a floating village. It had become a village waiting for a storm to break. And in the heart of the night, Miss Marple felt a familiar, grim certainty settle upon her. The tragedy she had sensed brewing was not a matter of if anymore, but when. And she feared she was the only one on board who understood that the pistol was merely a prop. The real weapons were the secrets festering in every heart. Death on the Nile, a Miss Marple mystery. Part 2, a whisper of silk and a shadowed glance. The morning sun upon the Nile was brilliant, but brought no warmth to the strained atmosphere aboard the Karnak. Miss Marple observed the breakfast scene with her usual quiet acuity. Linnet Doyle picked at her food, her beautiful face shadowed by sleeplessness and tension. Across from her, Simon Doyle played the part of the cheerful husband a bit too vigorously, his laughter ringing just a touch too loud in the quiet dining saloon. "The poor dear looks quite exhausted," Miss Marple murmured to Mrs. Clements, "and is trying rather too hard, don't you think? It reminds me of Mr. Henderson, the butcher's son, who always smiled brightest when he'd been up to some mischief." Jacqueline de Bellefort's absence was more conspicuous than her presence had been. The empty chair where she normally sat seemed to accuse the newlyweds with its very emptiness. The day's excursion to the Temple of Philly provided little respite from the tension. Passengers moved in isolated clusters, the magnificent ruins serving merely as backdrop to their human drama. Miss Marple, seemingly engrossed in her guidebook, noticed everything. She saw how Linnet and Simon walked together yet apart, separated by an invisible wall of unspoken anxieties. She observed Mrs. Van Schuyler's sharp eyes missing nothing, while her companion Miss Bowers maintained her usual efficient silence. It was behind a massive stone column that Miss Marple witnessed something significant. Rosalie Otterbourne had escaped her mother's dramatic monologue about ancient passions to steal a cigarette in private. Moments later, Jacqueline de Bellefort appeared, not as a hysterical woman of the previous evening, but composed and purposeful. "Could you spare one?" Jacqueline asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Rosalie looked startled, then shrugged and offered a cigarette case. As Jacqueline leaned in for a light, Miss Marple saw the brief but unmistakable exchange, a tiny, deliberate shake of Jacqueline's head. Not a greeting, but a signal, a silent "not now." Rosalie's eyes widened slightly before she turned away, exhaling smoke as if to disperse the unspoken message. Jacqueline walked on, leaving the younger woman visibly unsettled. "Now, that is interesting," Miss Marple murmured to a carved hieroglyphic. "It puts me in mind of the signals the grocer's boy used with the undergardener's daughter during their secret courtship." Back aboard the steamer, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to have thickened. After luncheon, Miss Marple decided a more direct approach was needed. She found Linnet's French maid, Louise, attending to her mistress's evening gowns on the promenade deck. "Oh, my day," Miss Marple began with carefully crafted helplessness. "I wonder if you might assist me? I've snagged my best cardigan, and I'm quite hopeless with a darning needle. They say French women have such a natural talent for these things." The appeal to professional pride worked perfectly. Soon they were seated with a damaged cardigan between them, and Louise was chatting freely as her nimble fingers worked. "That Mademoiselle Jacqueline," Louise confided. "She torments my poor madam. Last night, madam was certain she heard someone at her door. She sent me to look, but there was no one." More significantly, she added, "After that pistol business, madam made Monsieur Simon lock all her jewels in the purser safe, her pearls, everything. She said she couldn't bear having them in the cabin with that madwoman aboard." "Very wise," Miss Marple murmured, storing this information away. The evening brought another confrontation. Miss Marple and Mrs. Clements came upon Jacqueline sobbing dramatically, clinging to Simon's arm and begging for forgiveness. When Linnet appeared, cold with fury, Jacqueline's tears vanished, replaced by venom. "Your husband," she spat at Linnet. "You stole him. I hate you." She fled, leaving silence in her wake. That night, Miss Marple was awakened by a muffled pop, unmistakably a pistol shot. A man's anguished cry followed, then running feet. She emerged from her cabin to find chaos. Dr. Bessner hurried toward the Doyle suite. Simon Doyle stood frozen in his doorway, face ashen. "Linnet," he cried. "My God, no." Through the open door, Miss Marple saw Linnet lying still in bed, a dark stain spreading on her pillow. Most strikingly, the pearls Louise had said were locked away gleamed around her neck. In the next cabin, Jacqueline sat catatonic on her bed, the pearl-handled pistol dangling from her fingers. The solution seemed obvious. The jilted lover had finally acted. But as Miss Marple's eyes moved from Simon's theatrical grief to Jacqueline's stunned state to those inexplicably present pearls, she felt deep suspicion. "It is exactly what it appears to be," she murmured, "which is why it cannot possibly be." Spotting a crumpled paper near Jacqueline's door, she discreetly retrieved it. Back in her cabin, she smoothed the fragment under her lamp. It was in Linnet's handwriting. "Impossible to go on. I see now it was all a terrible mistake, a hollow sham. I have written to Andrew to begin the proceedings." The word proceedings suggested divorce. If Simon knew his wealthy wife planned to leave him, his motive became as strong as Jacqueline's. The obvious solution, Miss Marple suspected, might be hiding a much colder truth. Part 3. A patchwork of lies. The following hours on the Karnak were a study in organized chaos, underpinned by a deep, humming dread. The ship's captain, a man named Maitland whose authority was usually confined to navigational charts and social pleasantries, found himself thrust into the role of chief investigator. His face was pale and deeply troubled as he attempted to impose order on the terrifying situation. Miss Marple, having dressed with quiet efficiency, presented herself at the door of the main saloon, which had been commandeered as an interview room. She found Captain Maitland looking overwhelmed, the evidence laid out before him on a green baize table. The pearl-handled pistol, now tagged, and a single spent cartridge. "It seems dreadfully straightforward, Miss Marple," the captain said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief once she was seated. "The de Bellefort girl had the motive, made public threats, and was found with a weapon in her hand. She was seen by Dr. Bessner in a highly agitated state just moments before the shot was fired. It's an open-and-shut case." "It does appear so, on the surface," Miss Marple agreed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "But then, so did the business of the missing church funds, which everyone was sure the sexton had taken, when in fact it was the treasurer's wife all along, to pay for her son's gambling debts. Appearances can be so deceptive." The captain blinked, nonplussed by the village analogy. "Yes, well, in this case, the appearances are rather compelling. What else could it be?" "That is the question, isn't it?" Miss Marple replied mildly. "Might I ask, Captain, about the pearls? I had understood from a reliable source that Mrs. Doyle's jewels, including those pearls, had been placed in the purser's safe for safekeeping." The captain looked slightly uncomfortable. "That is correct. Mr. Doyle confirmed that himself. He said his wife had a sudden fancy to wear them last night after all, so he retrieved them from the safe before dinner. The key was in his possession. "I see," said Miss Marple, and indeed she was beginning to see a great deal. How very convenient. She was dismissed soon after, her gentle questioning seeming to have made little impression. But as she left, she noticed Simon Doyle being let in for his interview. His performance of the grief-stricken widower was masterful, his broad shoulders slumped, his voice breaking as he described his horror at discovering his murdered wife. Miss Marple observed, however, that his eyes, when they briefly met Hayes, were not red-rimmed from weeping, but clear and sharp. It put her in mind of a travelling actor who came to St. Mary Mead one summer, who could conjure tears on command but whose eyes remained as calculating as a farmer pricing a pig. Her next move was strategic. She sought out Rosalie Otterbourne, finding the girl huddled in a secluded corner of the deck, her usual sullenness replaced by a palpable, jittery fear. "My dear," Miss Marple began, settling herself beside the girl without invitation. "This is all so very dreadful. A terrible shock for someone so young." Rosalie shot her a suspicious glance. "It's dreadful for everyone, isn't it?" Of course, but I couldn't help noticing you seemed rather acquainted with Mr. Belfort at the temple yesterday." The girl stiffened. "I barely know her. She just asked for a cigarette." "It seemed a little more than that." Miss Marple pressed gently, her tone as soft as thistledown. "It seemed as if you had an understanding. A signal, perhaps? It reminds me of two girls in my own village who used similar signs to warn each other when the vicar was approaching, and they were up to some mischief." Rosalie's face drained of what little color it had. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're imagining things." "Am I?" Miss Marple's blue eyes were unwavering. "My dear child, you look frightened. And not just of the murder. You are frightened of being entangled in something you do not understand. The safest course in such situations is always the truth. Lies have a way of tangling one up worse than old knitting wool." For a long moment, Rosalie looked as if she might confess something. Her lips trembled. Then her mother's dramatic voice cut through the air, calling for her, and the moment shattered. Rosalie fled, throwing a last, panicked look over her shoulder. Next, Miss Marple turned her attention to the servants, knowing they often saw the clearest picture from the shadows. She found Louise Bourget looking genuinely distraught, her neat composure shattered. "Oh, madam, it is too horrible," the maid wept. "My poor, beautiful madam." "It is a tragedy," Miss Marple soothed. "And you were so devoted to her. Tell me, Louise, you said Mrs. Doyle heard someone at her door last night. Could it have been someone bringing back the pearls? After all, they were found on her." Louise looked confused. "But no, madam. Monsieur Simon. He brought them to her before dinner. I saw them on her dressing-table myself when I helped her prepare. She was wearing them in the saloon." This was a new, crucial detail. So the pearls had been out of the safe all evening. Anyone could have known they were in the cabin. "And after the shot," Miss Marple asked delicately, "did you see anything? Hear anything else?" Louise dropped her voice to a terrified whisper. "I saw her, madam, the one with the pistol. She came out of her cabin just after the shot. She was laughing, madam, a soft, horrible laugh. Then she went back inside." This damning testimony should have settled the matter. Yet it only deepened Miss Marple's suspicions. It was all too perfect. Jacqueline, however passionate, was not a fool. Would she really sit laughing maniacally with a murder weapon in her hand, waiting to be caught? It was the behavior of a stage villain, not a real person. Later, under the pretense of needing air, Miss Marple walked slowly past the Doyle suite. The cabin had been sealed, but she paused, her eyes scanning the deck. There, caught in a crack between planks near the railing, was a tiny, glinting object. Using the tip of her parasol, she worked it loose. It was a single, cultured pearl, identical to those in Linnet's necklace. And a few feet away, almost invisible against the dark wood, was a small, dark smay. Her heart quickened. This was not part of the official story. The broken string of pearls in the cabin had been found scattered on the floor inside. This single pearl was outside, and the smear, it looked very much like blood. Piecing it together with a fragment of letter in her pocket, a new, terrifying narrative began to form. The letter suggested Linnet knew her marriage was a hollow sham. Louise confirmed the pearls were in the cabin all evening. The outside pearl and the blood smear suggested a struggle, or perhaps a second act to the tragedy that had taken place out here on the deck. What if Jacqueline's shot had not been the only one fired? What if the obvious crime was merely a cover for a darker, more calculated one? She thought of Simon Doyle's clear, dry eyes. She thought of the retrieved pearls. She thought of the silent signal between Jacqueline and Rosalie, a signal that might not have been one of conspiracy, but a warning, or even of a plan gone terribly wrong. The patchwork of lies were beginning to unravel, and the pattern emerging was far more sinister than a simple crime of passion. It was, she feared, a cold-blooded plot, and the most obvious suspect was likely the perfect pawn. Part 4. The Pawn's Confession. The single pearl, cool and smooth against her palm, felt heavier than its size suggested. It was a truth, a hard, small fact that contradicted the official story. Slipping it into her pocket alongside the torn letter fragment, Miss Marple knew the time for quiet observation was over. It was time to confront the heart of the mystery, and that heart, she believed, was a catatonic girl in cabin 3. Gaining access to Jacqueline de Bellefort required a combination of gentle authority and strategic persuasion. Miss Marple found Dr. Bessner, who had administered a sedative to the distraught young woman. "The child is in no state for questions," he blustered, his mustache quivering. "She is in a state of profound shock." "Precisely, Doctor," Miss Marple replied, her tone suggesting a shared medical understanding. "In my experience, it is often in these first hours, before the mind has built its fortifications of lies and excuses, that the truest version of events can emerge. It is like getting to a stain before it sets. Once the story hardens, it becomes so much more difficult to get at the truth." Baffled by this domestic analogy but somewhat disarmed, the doctor reluctantly agreed to let her have 5 minutes, on the condition he remain present. The cabin was dim, the curtains drawn. Jacqueline lay on the bed, not asleep, but staring at the ceiling as if it were a vast, empty screen. She was pale, her dark hair a stark contrast to the white pillow. The dramatic, passionate girl was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell. "Mr. Belfort," Miss Marple began, her voice as soft as a rustle of leaves. She did not sit, but stood by the bed, a quiet, unthreatening presence. "I know you did not mean for any of this to happen." There was no response, not even a flicker of the eyes. "They are saying you killed Linnet Doyle in a jealous rage. They have the pistol. They have the witnesses who heard your threats. It is a very compelling case." Still, nothing. Dr. Bessner shifted his weight impatiently. "But you see, my dear," Miss Marple continued, "I do not think you are a murderer. I think you are a fool. A terribly, tragically foolish young woman who loved the wrong man. It reminds me of a girl from my own village, Flora Saunders, who was so besotted with a charming ne'er-do-well that she helped him steal from her own father, believing his promises of a life together. He was arrested, of course, and she was left with nothing but shame." This time, a single tear escaped from the corner of Jacqueline's eye and traced a path down her temple into her hair. "I found a piece of paper. Jackie," Miss Marple said, dropping the formal address. "A letter from Linnet. She was going to divorce him. She called their marriage a hollow sham." Jacqueline's breath hitched. A low, broken sound escaped her lips. "He knew, didn't he?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice still gentle but relentless. "Simon knew she was going to leave him, and he would be left with nothing. All that beautiful money, gone. So he came to you. He spun you a tale, a desperate, final plan to win you both the freedom and the fortune. A plan where you would play the vengeful ex-lover, creating a scene, even firing a shot, but not to kill. Never to kill. Was that it?" Jacqueline turned her head slowly on the pillow. Her eyes, wide and drowned in misery, met Miss Marple's. It was a confession in itself. "He said it would be a fright," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse and tears. "Just a fright. I was to fire the shot into the ceiling, or the wall, to make a noise, to make everyone believe I was capable of it. He said it would cement my alibi for him later. He said he would take care of the rest. He promised me we would be together after it was all over." A sob racked her body. I loved him. I believed him. Dr. Bessner was staring, his medical certainty shaken. What happened last night, child? Miss Marple asked, sitting on the edge of the bed now. What truly happened? The story tumbled out in fits and starts, a pathetic narrative of manipulated passion. Simon had come to her cabin. He had been desperate, convincing. The plan was for her to create a disturbance, fire the shot, and then he was vague on the details, but he swore it would make them safe and rich. He had given her a glass of brandy to steady her nerves. She remembered feeling dizzy, confused. I heard the shot, she whispered, her eyes wide with the memory. But it wasn't me. I was still holding the pistol, but I hadn't pulled the trigger. Not yet. Then Simon was shaking me, taking the pistol from my hand. He was telling me to be quiet, to sit still. He said everything was going to plan. He said Linnet was dead. She had been too stunned, too drugged and bewildered to process it. She had sat there as instructed while he left the cabin. The next thing she knew, the boat was in an uproar, and she was found with a pistol in her hand. He used you, Miss Marple said, her voice filled with a weary sadness. He used your love to make you the perfect scapegoat. Your public threats, your possession of the pistol, your presence at the scene. It was all a stage he set, and he cast you as a murderer. The pieces clicked into place with chilling precision. The brandy, likely drugged to ensure her compliance and cloud her memory. The shot she heard was a real one, fired by Simon, killing his wife. He then rushed into Jackie's cabin, took her pistol, which she had, in her confused state, yet afire, and ensured her fingerprints were fresh upon it. She was a pawn, moved into position to be sacrificed. But the pearls, Miss Marple mused aloud, and the blood on the deck. Jacqueline shook her head, confused. She knew nothing of that. Leaving the grieving, betrayed girl in Dr. Bessner's now more sympathetic care, Miss Marple emerged from the cabin. The narrative had been completely overturned. This was no crime of passion. It was a cold, premeditated act of greed, using a human heart as its primary tool. She now understood the silent signal at the temple. Rosalie, sharp-eyed and observant, must have suspected something of the plot, or perhaps had seen Simon and Jackie together. Her shake of the head to Jackie was a warning. Don't go through with it. This is a mistake. The mystery was no longer who, but how. How did Simon Doyle, apparently shot in the leg and in a state of panic, manage the mechanics of the crime? How did the pearls and the blood come to be outside? She sought out the one person whose testimony might be colored by a different kind of knowledge, the maid, Louise Bourget. She found her not in the servants' quarters, but lurking nervously near the purser's office. Louise, Miss Marple said, her tone leaving no room for pretense. You were not entirely truthful with me, were you? The woman's face crumpled. Madam, I saw something else. After the first shot, I was frightened. I opened my door, just a crack. I saw Monsieur Simon. He was not in his cabin. He was out on the deck, leaning over the railing. He had something in his hand, something that glittered. Then he turned, and he saw me watching. He came to me, he said. He said if I told anyone I saw him, I would be implicated as his accomplice. But if I said I saw Mademoiselle Jacqueline laughing with a pistol, he would make it worth my while. He gave me this. With a trembling hand, she opened her fist. In her palm lay a stack of high-denomination banknotes. He was throwing something overboard, Louise whispered, terror in her eyes. I think it was another pistol. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with a silent, terrible crash. The perfect, simple story was a tapestry of lies, woven by a cunning and ruthless man. Simon Doyle had not been a victim of the shooting. He had been its architect, and Miss Marple now had the threads to unravel his entire scheme. All that remained was to gather everyone together and see the pattern for themselves. Death on the Nile, a Miss Marple mystery. Part 5, The Geometry of a Crime. Armed with the pawn's confession and the maid's terrified testimony, Miss Marple knew the time had come to act. The fragile construct of Simon Doyle's lies needed to be challenged before it could harden into accepted truth. She requested a private audience with Captain Maitland in his cabin, a small, functional space that now felt like the nerve center of the investigation. The captain listened, his initial skepticism slowly eroding under the relentless, quiet logic of the elderly lady from St. Mary Mead. She presented her evidence not as dramatic revelations, but as simple, stubborn facts that refused to fit the convenient narrative. "Captain," she began, her knitting needles clicking a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to her words, "everyone is so very fond of believing the obvious. It is comfortable, but crime, in my experience, is rarely comfortable or obvious. It is a tangled skein of wool, and one must find the correct end to pull." She laid out her case piece by piece, like placing patches on a quilt. First, the pearl. She placed a single cultured pearl on his desk. This was found on the deck, "Captain," outside the Doyle cabin. The official story is that the string broke during a struggle inside the cabin. So how did this one pearl find its way outside? It suggests to me that the necklace was broken out there, not in the bedroom. Next, the letter. She smoothed the fragment of Linnet's writing. This suggests Mrs. Doyle was contemplating divorce. This provides Mr. Doyle with a powerful motive far beyond mere passion, cold, financial desperation. Then, the confession. She relayed Jacqueline's pathetic story, the proposed plot to stage her fright, the drug brandy, the confusion, and the horrifying moment she realized she had been used. She is not a murderess, Captain. She is a dupe, a heartbroken girl manipulated by a man she loved into being the perfect scapegoat. Finally, the maid's testimony. She did not reveal Louise's name, protecting the frightened woman, but conveyed the essence, an eyewitness who saw Simon Doyle on the deck after the shot, disposing of something glittering, a second pistol, and then bribing her to lie about seeing Jacqueline. Captain Maitland, a man of charts and coordinates, struggled with this web of human deception. A second pistol? But that doesn't make sense, Miss Marple. Dr. Bessner treated Doyle for a gunshot wound to the leg. The bullet was from the small-caliber pistol, the one we found with Mr. Bellefort. Precisely, Miss Marple said, her eyes gleaming. And that is the final, clever piece of his geometry. He shot his wife through the temple with one gun, a different gun, which he then threw overboard. But he needed to be a victim, not a perpetrator. So, he then shot himself in the leg with Jacqueline's small pistol, a painful but superficial wound. It explained his presence at the scene, his blood on the sheets, and perfectly framed Jacqueline, whose pistol provided the bullet in his leg. The shot everyone heard was a fatal one. The one he fired into his own leg was likely muffled, perhaps by a pillow, and lost in the general panic and confusion that followed the first. The captain stared at her, the sheer, cold-blooded audacity of the plan dawning on him. Good heavens! So the blood on the deck was most likely his own, from his self-inflicted wound, dripped as he stood at the railing disposing of the murder weapon. The broken pearl may have snagged on his clothing or fallen during a struggle we know nothing of. Perhaps Linnet did not die as peacefully as it seemed. It was a theory, but it was a theory that accounted for every anomaly. The out-of-place pearl, the blood on the deck, the drugged and confused Jacqueline, the bribe maid, and a convenient, non-fatal wound. We have no proof of this second pistol, the captain said weakly, though he was visibly shaken. It is at the bottom of the Nile. We have the testimony of a witness who saw him throw it, Miss Marple countered, and we have the evidence of the wound itself. Dr. Bessner can confirm the angle and the nature of the injury. A self-inflicted wound to the leg is often very different from one delivered by an assailant. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. Captain, there is one more thing. The psychology of it. Simon Doyle has been performing the role of the grieving husband. But have you noticed he never looks at his wife's body? He speaks of her. He moans her name, but his eyes are always elsewhere, calculating, watching the reactions of others. True grief, in my observation, is a quieter, more inward thing. It does not perform. A quiet knock came at the door. It was the purser. Excuse me, Captain, but we've found something. When cleaning the deck this morning, one of the boys found this caught in a scupper. He held out a small, sodden object. It was a man's monogrammed handkerchief, stained a rusty brown with what could only be blood, embroidered in one corner with the initials SD. Captain Maitland took the handkerchief, his face a mask of grim realization. The geometry of the crime was now complete. Simon Doyle had used this to staunch the blood from his self-inflicted wound before tossing it aside. In his focus on disposing of the major evidence, the gun, he had forgotten this small, damning detail. "That," said Miss Marple softly, "is what we in St. Mary Mead would call a fortunate discovery. It is remarkable how often the smallest domestic detail can unravel the grandest of schemes." The captain stood up, his decision made. "I must confront him with this. But I will need to gather everyone." The shock of the accusation, in front of everyone, may provoke a confession. "A sound strategy," Miss Marple agreed. "It is always more difficult to maintain a lie when faced with a united front of truth. He has relied on isolating his story, on controlling the narrative. Take that control away, and the facade may well crumble." As the captain made arrangements, Miss Marple returned to the deck. The sun was high now, the Nile a dazzling ribbon of light. She saw Simon Doyle sitting in a deck chair, his leg propped up, accepting a glass of lemonade from a steward. He looked the picture of a convalescing man, wronged by fate. He caught her eye and gave a small, sad smile. Miss Marple merely nodded in return, her own expression one of polite, unreadable calm. She knew the performance was almost over. The final act was about to begin, and she had ensured that the stage was no longer his command. The floating village of the Karnak was preparing to deliver its own verdict. Death on the Nile, a Miss Marple mystery. Part 6, a drawing-room confrontation. The main saloon of the Karnak had been transformed. The air of leisurely luxury was gone, replaced by a tense, judicial formality. The passengers, assembled at Captain Maitland's request, sat in a loose semicircle. Their faces were a study in varying degrees of anxiety, suspicion, and grim curiosity. Mrs. Van Schuyler looked offended by the disruption. Dr. Bessner was professionally solemn. Rosalie Otterbourne chewed her lip, her eyes darting nervously. The socialist Mr. Ferguson scowled, as if the entire proceeding was a bourgeois farce. At the center of it all, Simon Doyle reclined in a chair, his bandaged leg prominently displayed. He managed to look both wounded and nobly long-suffering. Captain Maitland stood before them, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering. Further evidence has come to light regarding the death of Mrs. Linnet Doyle, evidence that compels me to reopen certain lines of inquiry." A murmur rippled through the room. Simon's face showed a flash of wary confusion. "What evidence? Captain? I thought it was clear what happened. That madwoman." He gestured vaguely in the direction of Jacqueline's cabin. "The situation is more complex than it first appeared," the captain said, his voice steady. He glanced towards a quiet corner where Miss Marple sat, her knitting needles clicking softly. She did not look up, but her presence was suddenly palpable. It has been suggested that the geometry of the crime does not fit the simple narrative. Simon gave a short, bitter laugh that sounded a little forced. "Geometry? What on earth are you talking about? My wife was shot in her bed with Jackie's pistol. What geometry is there to that?" It was then that Miss Marple spoke, her voice gentle yet carrying to every corner of the saloon. "It is all a matter of placing things in their proper context, Mr. Doyle. It reminded me so much of a puzzle we had in the St. Mary Mead Parish newsletter. All the pieces seemed to form one picture, but if you looked at them from a slightly different angle, a completely different image emerged." Simon stared at her, a flicker of contempt in his eyes for the interfering old woman. "This isn't a parish newsletter, Miss Marple. This is my wife's murder." "Precisely," she said, finally looking up, her blue eyes meeting his with unnerving directness. "Which is why we must be so very careful with the truth. Let us begin with the pearls, shall we? Everyone believed the string was broken in the struggle inside the cabin. But you see, I found this." She held up the single, gleaming pearl between her thumb and forefinger. "On the deck. Outside. How do you suppose it got there, Mr. Doyle?" The room was utterly silent. Simon's jaw tightened. "It must have rolled." "Oh, I think not," Miss Marple replied. "Pearls don't roll through closed doors. It suggests the necklace was broken during an altercation on the deck, an altercation that officially never happened." She let that hang in the air before continuing. "Then there's the matter of your wound, Mr. Doyle. Dr. Bessner, would you say the bullet that struck Mr. Doyle's leg was fired at close range?" The doctor nodded, adjusting his spectacles. The powder burns indicate it was, yes, very close. And the angle, Dr. Bessner considered, it was upward through the fleshy part of the thigh. An awkward angle for an assailant standing over you, wouldn't you say? Miss Marple inquired mildly, but a very convenient one for a man sitting or kneeling, who wishes to inflict a painful but not fatal wound upon himself. A gasp went through the room. Simon's face flushed a dark, mottled red. That's a monstrous accusation. Is it? Miss Marple's needles never paused. It would explain the blood on the deck, you see. Your blood, from your self-inflicted injury, dripped as you stood at the railing, disposing of the real murder weapon, a different pistol altogether, after you had shot your wife through the temple with it. Panic was now dawning in Simon's eyes. He looked from Miss Marple to the captain, seeking a male ally. This is insane. Why would I do such a thing? For the oldest and simplest reason, Mr. Doyle. Money. Miss Marple produced a fragment of letter from her pocket. Your wife had discovered your marriage was a hollow sham. She was writing to her lawyer, Mr. Pennington, to begin the proceedings. I presume she meant divorce. You would have been left with nothing. So you devised a plan. You would have your fortune and your freedom, and you would use the one person everyone would believe was a culprit, the passionate, jilted Jacqueline. She then laid out the entire chilling scheme, just as she had for the captain. The manipulation of Jackie, the drug brandy to ensure her confusion, the single, fatal shot from his own gun, the theatrical self-inflicted wound with Jackie's pistol, and the cold-blooded framing of the woman who loved him. You are a clever man, Mr. Doyle, Miss Marple said, and there was no compliment in her tone, only a profound weariness. You thought of everything, except for the small, human details. You forgot a single pearl. You left a blooded handkerchief with your initials in a scupper. Captain Maitland placed a sodden, stained cloth on the table, and you underestimated the perception of a frightened French maid who saw you on the deck and whom you had to bribe into lying. Simon Doyle was crumbling. The bluff, hearty demeanor had vanished, replaced by the face of a cornered, vicious animal. She's lying. They are all lying. That old woman is a crazy, meddling spinster with nothing but village gossip in her head. His outburst was his undoing. The violence of his denial, the personal vitriol, confirmed the truth of Miss Marple's quiet reasoning more than any confession could have. It was then that Jacqueline de Bellefort, supported by Dr. Bessner, appeared in the doorway. She was pale and fragile, but her eyes, clear for the first time, were fixed on Simon with a look of utter, devastated clarity. "You told me you loved me," she whispered, her voice breaking the horrified silence. "You told me it was just a fright." That was a final, crushing blow. The last vestige of Simon's composure shattered. He looked at the ring of accusing faces, at the damning evidence on the table, at the woman he had so callously betrayed. The geometry of his perfect crime had been meticulously dismantled, piece by piece, by an old lady with knitting needles and an unshakable knowledge of the human heart. He did not confess in a grand, dramatic speech. He simply slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands, a silent admission of guilt. The drawing-room confrontation was over. The truth, in all its ugly, calculated horror, stood plainly revealed. Death on the Nile, a Miss Marple mystery. Part 7, the whole pattern revealed. Simon Doyle's silent, slumped form was confession more eloquent than any shouted admission of guilt. A collective, horrified exhalation seemed to pass through the saloon. The performance was over. The charming, boyish husband was gone, and in his place sat a ruined man, exposed as a calculating murderer. Captain Maitland, his face set in grim lines, gave a quiet order to two of his stewards, who moved to stand by Simon's chair. The spell of stunned silence was broken by a flurry of gasps and muttered exclamations. Mrs. Van Schuyler fanned herself vigorously, while Miss Bowers watched with clinical, unsurprised eye. Mr. Ferguson looked almost disappointed that the culprit was a capitalist and not a political radical. But it was Miss Marple who spoke into the tumult, her voice, though quiet, commanding attention. She had not moved from her corner, her knitting now resting in her lap. "The truth, once seen, is really quite simple," she began, as if discussing a minor point of village gossip. "It is like looking at a piece of tapestry. From the front, you see the neat, pretty picture. But it is only by turning it over and seeing the tangled knots and loose ends that you understand how it was made. Mr. Doyle showed us all the pretty picture. It was necessary to look at the messy underside. She turned her gaze toward Jacqueline, who stood trembling in the doorway, supported by Dr. Bessner. The greatest cruelty, my dear, was not the frame itself, but the tool he used to construct it, your love. He knew you would believe him. He knew your passionate nature would make you the perfect, believable scapegoat. He poisoned you not once, but twice, first with drug brandy to cloud your mind and ensure your compliance, and then with a lie that would have cost you your life. Jacqueline flinched, fresh tears welling in her eyes, but they were tears of clarity now, of painful, necessary understanding. "But how, Miss Marple?" Rosalie Otterbourne burst out, her voice sharp with a mixture of fear and fascination. "How did he do it? The timings, the shots." "Ah, the mechanics of the thing," Miss Marple nodded. "That is where his cleverness truly lay. He orchestrated it like a conductor. He first ensured the pearls were in the cabin, a glittering prop. He then went to Mr. Bellefort, solidified their plan, and gave her the drugged brandy. Once she was in a suggestible, confused state, he returned to his own cabin." She paused, letting the scene form in their minds. He argued with Linnet, perhaps about the divorce. The argument spilled out onto the deck. That is when the pearl was lost. He then shot her with a different pistol, one he had doubtless acquired for this very purpose. The sound everyone heard was his single, fatal shot. "But his leg," interrupted Dr. Bessner. "The bullet was from the small pistol." "Precisely, Doctor. That was the second act of his play. Immediately after shooting his wife, he went back into Jackie's cabin. She was dazed, still holding her own pistol. He took it from her, and, in a moment of cold-blooded precision, shot himself in the leg. It was a painful, bleeding, but superficial wound. It served three purposes. It provided a victim other than the true target. It explained his presence and his blood at the scene, and it irrevocably linked the crime to Jackie's pistol. The shot was likely muffled, perhaps by a pillow, and lost in the general shock following the first, louder report. She turned her gaze back to Simon, who refused to look up. He then threw the murder weapon, the first pistol, overboard, an act witnessed by Louise Béget, whom he subsequently bribed and threatened into silence. He returned to the scene, crying out, playing the horrified widower, while his accomplice, the woman he professed to love, sat next door in a drugged stupor, holding the weapon that would condemn her. A collective shudder ran through the room. The sheer, ruthless efficiency of it was chilling. "I knew something was wrong from the very start," Miss Marple continued, almost to herself now. "It was all too neat. The passionate other woman, the public threats, the pistol found in her hand. It was the sort of story one reads in a cheap novel. But real evil, in my experience, is rarely so theatrical. It is quiet and patient, and wears a very pleasant face. It reminds me of a man who used to sell fraudulent insurance policies to the elderly in our village. He had the most charming smile." She looked around at the assembled company, her eyes lingering on each of them for a moment. "We all see the world through the lens of our own experiences. You saw a drama. I saw, I am sorry to say, a rather commonplace pattern of greed and betrayal, albeit executed with unusual ruthlessness. The specifics may change, but the essential human failings do not." Captain Maitland finally found his voice. "Miss Marple, we are in your debt. Your perspective has been invaluable." "It is merely a question of being willing to look beyond the obvious, Captain," she replied. "The obvious is so often a distraction." As the stewards helped the broken Simon Doyle to his feet to be taken away, the passengers began to disperse, their voices a hushed, excited babble. The mystery was solved, the killer revealed. But as Miss Marple watched Jacqueline de Bellefort, who was now sobbing quietly into her hands, she felt no triumph, only a deep, profound sadness for the wickedness that men could do, and the lives they could so carelessly shatter in the process. The crime on the Nile was over, but its echoes would linger long in the memory of all who had sailed on the ill-fated Karnak. And for Jane Marple, it would become another dark, confirming data point in her extensive and unsentimental understanding of the human condition. Death on the Nile, a Miss Marple mystery. Part 8. The Echoes in a Quiet Garden. The following morning, the Karnak seemed to sail under a different sky. The oppressive weight of secrecy and suspicion had lifted, but in its place settled a sober, weary silence. The business of the previous day, the official statements, the securing of the prisoner, the arrangement for the remains of the late Mrs. Doyle, had been conducted with a grim efficiency. Now, there was only the steady churn of the paddle wheel and the slow, majestic progress towards the Swan. Miss Marple was seated in her usual spot on the deck, her knitting needles moving steadily. The lilac wool was nearly gone, the cardigan almost restored. Mrs. Lavinia Clement sat beside her, a book open but unread on her lap. "I still cannot quite believe it, Jane," Lavinia said, breaking the quiet between them, "that a man could be so evil, to plan it all out so coldly, to use that poor girl in such a way. It is not so much evil, I think, as a profound and terrifying emptiness," Miss Marple replied, her eyes on the distant riverbank. "A lack of that moral compass which, for most of us, is as natural as breathing. Simon Doyle saw people not as souls, but as instruments. His wife was an instrument for wealth. Jacqueline was an instrument for his escape. It is a type of myopia, really, though a far more dangerous one than poor old Mr. Witherspoon's, who can only see his own roses. You saw through him from the beginning, didn't you?" Lavinia asked, with a note of awe. "I saw that the picture was wrong," Miss Marple corrected gently. "The pieces did not fit together as they should. The passionate, jilted lover is a powerful story, but it is a simple one. Life, in my experience, is rarely simple. It is complex and messy and full of quiet, desperate motivations. Greed is a far more common driver of tragedy than passion. Passion burns out. Greed only grows." She paused, her needle stilling for a moment. The pearls were the first real clue. Why were they around her neck when they should have been safe? It was a piece of staging. You see, a part of the pretty picture he was painting for us. A rich woman, murdered for her jewels in a crime of passion. But he was too clever by half. He forgot that real life is full of loose threads. One by one, the other passengers came to pay their respects, their attitudes forever altered towards a seemingly frail old lady. Dr. Bessner was the first, his manner now one of profound respect. A remarkable piece of deduction, Miss Marple. I confess I was entirely taken in. My medical mind looked only at the physical evidence, the wound, the pistol. I failed to consider the psychology of the wound. "It is an easy thing to do, Doctor," she said. "We are all experts in our own fields. But crime spills over into so many areas, does it not? Medicine, finance, and of course, the human heart." Rosalie Otterbourne approached hesitantly. I wanted to thank you," she mumbled, her usual sullenness replaced by a kind of awed gratitude. "That signal I gave Jackie at the temple. I knew something was wrong. I could see she was being manipulated, but I was too frightened to say anything. I thought if I warned her, it might just go away." "You acted as you thought best, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "It is a heavy burden for one so young to carry, but you must not blame yourself. The person at fault is the one who orchestrated this terrible business." Even the formidable Mrs. Van Schuyler acknowledged her with a stiff nod. "You have a singular mind, Miss Marple. Most unexpected." It was, from her, the highest of praise. The final approach to a Swan was a somber affair. The grand temples and lush islands seemed to mock the small human tragedy that had played out on the steamer's decks. As the gangplank was lowered, the passengers disembarked with a haste that spoke of their desire to leave the memory of the Karnak behind them. Simon Doyle had been taken into official custody at a previous stop, a broken and silent figure. Jacqueline de Bellefort, under the care of Dr. Bessner, who had insisted on seeing her to a proper sanatorium, was a ghost of her former self, her vibrant passion extinguished by betrayal. Standing on the dock amidst the bustle of porters and tourists, Miss Marple took a final look back at the white steamer. It was no longer a floating village, just a ship again. "Well, Lavinia," she said, turning to her friend, "I think that is quite enough excitement for one holiday." A few weeks later, Miss Marple was back in her garden at St. Mary Mead. The English sun was softer, the air cooler and filled with the scent of roses and damp earth. She was deadheading a late-blooming rose, her hands covered in gardening gloves. A neighbor, passing by the fence, called out, "Had a good trip, Miss Marple? See any exciting foreign dramas?" Miss Marple looked up, a gentle, knowing smile on her face. "It was very interesting, Mrs. Carter. Very interesting indeed. It is remarkable, but the world, for all its size and strangeness, is really very small. The same patterns repeat themselves everywhere one goes." She snipped off a withered bloom and dropped it into her basket. The crime on the Nile, with its backdrop of ancient temples and glittering water, already seemed like a distant, feverish dream. But the truths it had revealed about greed, deception, and the dark potential of the human heart felt as immediate and as real as the soil beneath her feet. She tucked her secateurs into her apron pocket and went inside to put the kettle on. The world was full of noise and drama, but here, in her quiet cottage, there was peace. And for now, that was enough. The echoes of the Nile had faded, replaced by the familiar, comforting silence of home.